Hey guys, John here. So here's what's going on. As you know, a little while back I sent out a post on Facebook, I sent out an email, posts on Twitter, so on and so forth, and asked you guys if you would be interested in a MySQL course. And as you probably saw yourself, the response to that was pretty overwhelming. Tons of people would like to know how to do that, and to be honest with you, I wasn't super surprised by it because, as you can imagine, I get a bunch of emails and messages on a daily basis, people asking me for help with their different parts of coding. And by far the biggest request that I get is help with working between MySQL and PHP. So I wasn't super surprised. I kind of had a hunch that a lot of people would want to know how to do that. And so what I've done is I've created a course where I'm going to teach you exactly what you need to know to get over that hump with PHP and MySQL. And so in that course, we're going to talk about all kinds of things, from using prepared statements to structuring your database and object model to creating, abstracting a database class, to all the basics to select, insert, update, delete, pretty much everything that you would need to know, again, to get over that hump of working with PHP and MySQL. But before I get into all that, what I want to do is I want to give you a sneak peek at the first lesson inside of that course. And what this lesson is how to structure your database and your object model. And I want to make sure I convey to you just how important that particular skill is, because if you don't get this particular piece right, it can cause you a ton of headache down the road with your code. The analogy I like to use is that of a house. Now, you probably can see a few houses behind me here now. What I want you to imagine if you were building a house and you laid out your ground, you built your footing, you built up your basement, and you started actually building the house, framing it out and doing all that, and suddenly you realized that there was something wrong with your basement and that you needed to go back and change your basement. Well, what would happen in that case? Well, what would happen is that you'd have to completely tear down everything you've built in terms of the house, and you'd probably have to tear down a good part of your basement in order to fix it, and then you'd have to rebuild everything that you've just done. And if you take it a step further, if you imagine, well, maybe it's not something that's wrong with the basement, maybe it's something that's wrong with the actual footing or the layout or how the ground is leveled or whatever it is, you'd actually not only have to take down what you've built in terms of the house, but you'd also have to take down the entire basement. You'd have to pull out footings and redo the whole thing. Well, that's a lot like your object model and your database structure when it comes to coding. Think of your object model and your database structure as the footings and the basement of your house. If you don't get those right, as you get into coding out your application, you'll almost always run into some sort of roadblock or limitation that's going to cause you to go back and have to change your database structure, change your object model. And to do that, you're going to have to tear out a bunch of coding and rewrite all of that code. Now, I want to save you that headache. So in this video, I'm going to show you not only how to structure your database model, but how to structure it in a way where you can rest assured that no matter what scenario you might encounter with your application going forward, you can build your database and your object model in a way where you can account for those scenarios. So that's the video that is going to play right as soon as I get done here. You can check that out. Now, before you get into that, I want to make sure that you can get access to the future videos that I'm going to release as we go forward with this course. So over to the right of this video, you're going to see a place to enter your name and email address. Go ahead and do that now, and I'll notify you when the future videos are available. So again, if you want to be notified when new videos are available for you to see, enter your name and email to the right, and then come back here and you can watch the how to structure your database and object model video. All right, so hope you enjoyed that video. Let me know what you think, and I'll talk to you later. Hey guys, John here, and in this video we're going to talk about how to structure your database. Now, part of this is going to be a little bit conceptual, so you can see here I'm actually inside of Paint, so I can draw some pictures for you. You can see my awesome drawing skills, but this is important to understand how to structure your database for your application so that your database is set up correctly and can handle everything that you want to do now and that you might want to do in the future. In fact,
when I look at code that I get sent to me or I see or whatever when people are building their own applications, this is one of the biggest mistakes that I see, is that the database structure isn't very flexible and it's not very scalable, and so that down the road the person that has built it is going to have a hard time being able to add things to it. So I want to show you how to structure your database first. I know this is a MySQL and PHP course and you probably want to get into some code, but I think I'd be remiss if I didn't show this to you here. All right, so we're going to do a little drawing first, and then we're going to jump over to PHP My Admin, and we're going to take a look at a database structure and how you can kind of mirror that. All right, so when you're designing an application, at the end of the day, if you dissect it all and you break it all down to its fundamental parts, you're going to have a few things. The majority of which are going to be objects. Okay, so you probably heard of object-oriented programming. I don't want you to get necessarily too confused with that, but object-oriented programming is based around this idea, but I don't want you to just think in terms of a class or something like that. I don't want you to get lost in that. When I say objects, essentially what I'm talking about is the things that your application is going to create. So for example, if you have a content management system like WordPress or Joomla or Drupal, then the things that your application is going to create are maybe posts, maybe pages, you may have categories, you may have tags, so on and so forth. Those are the different objects that you might have in a CMS. Now, if you're building a social network, then you might have objects that are users. You may have statuses, so an individual status would be an object. Whatever the case may be in terms of a social network, any kind of application that you're going to create is going to have a certain set of objects that are associated with it. All right. So the first thing that you want to do is you want to identify what those objects are. Okay. So you want to, I'm going to put a big O here for object. You want to figure out what all of the objects that are going to be required for your application. So if you're sitting down to write a CMS, then you might say, well, I need posts, I need pages, I need categories, I need tags, I need users, so on and so forth. Okay, so you'd lay that all out. That's the first thing that you need. And this is going to be important when we get into the rest of your database structure. The next thing that you're going to look at is you're going to look at what those objects can do. Okay, so certain objects can do certain things. So for example, in a CMS, let's just put a U here for user and a P here for post. Your users can create posts. Okay, so we'll put a C here for create. Your users can create posts. That's an action that your user, one of your objects, can take. Okay, so that's going to start to, again, become important when we talk about the code that you're going to write. You're going to have to write the code that allows the user to create the post, and it's going to be, the user is going to be able to fill in certain information. It's going to be able to do that based on certain parameters. For example, in WordPress, you have roles. So if you are an administrator, an editor, an author, you can create posts. But if you're just a regular subscriber, you can't create posts. So again, they'll be able to create posts and fill in certain information, and also according to certain parameters that you define. Okay, so you have actions, so you have objects, you have actions, and probably the last thing that you're going to have is relationships. Okay, so we'll put an R here. Probably won't even use that box. Actually, I'll just do this like this. Okay, so you're going to have relationships between different objects. So we'll put over here, this is an object, but we'll put a C. Here we'll put, this is an object, we'll put a T. That's for categories and tags. So you're going to have relationships between these different objects. And actually, this will go here. Okay, so what that means is you're going to have certain objects that can be somehow tied to other objects. So for example, if you create a post, then that a post can belong to a category, or it can belong to a tag. That's a relationship between those two objects. So again, in your database structure and also in your code, you're going to have to account for that. You're going to have some way to be able to identify that a certain post is related to a certain category or a certain tag in a certain way. Okay, and I'm going to get into specifics about how you want to set this up. It's actually a lot easier than you might think, but I want to give you the conceptual overview of it. Okay, so again, you're going to have objects, you're going to have actions, and you're going to have relationships. Those are the main things that you're going to be paying attention to when you're creating your database and writing your application. Essentially, an application is a collection of objects, actions, and relationships. Okay? So again, with the CMS, you might have posts that belong to categories of tags. With a social network, you might have users that belong to a group or are connected to other users. Again, depending on your application, those are all going to look a little bit different, but for the most part, those are the main things that you're going to have, or those are the broad things that you're going to have: objects, actions, and relationships. All right, so now let's go ahead and go over to a database, and I'm going to have you take a look at a database structure that can give you some insight in how to do this. Now, here we are in PHP admin, and this is the WordPress database. If you know me, I work with WordPress on a daily basis. That's what my job consists of. So it's not surprising that I'm going to show you the WordPress database, but I want you to kind of ignore all of these different tables. This is essentially the WordPress database on my local host, and these are a bunch of different tables for different plugins and so on and so forth. I want you to ignore 90% of it and only pay attention to the things that I'm going to show you. Okay? So we talked about objects. The first table that I want to talk to you about then is one of the object tables, WP posts. Okay? So this is essentially an object table. That's what the name I would give it. And what this is designed to do is to store instances of a post object. Okay? So we have our posts, we have a list of different records that are essentially different posts that we've created for our site. Okay, so we have hello world, sample page, incorrect use of this, so on and so forth. We have a bunch of different posts in here. What I want you to pay attention to are the different columns that we have here. Okay, so when you create a object table, there's certain data that's going to be crucial or required for your object. Okay, so when we create a table to store instances of an object, we want to make sure that the data that we're collecting is what we absolutely need and nothing more. Okay, nothing less, but nothing more. So you'll notice that we have the ID. Of course, you're always going to have that. You have the author. You have the date in GMT time. You have the actual content. You have the title, excerpt status, comment status, and you have a number of different columns that the people who created this database have said that this is information that's essentially, or for the most part, required for this object. Okay, so again, you want to look at your object, whatever it is, if it's a user, if it's a post, if it's a status, whatever it is, you want to look at it and identify what the required information is. You want to put that into fields, and you want to have nothing more, but you also want to have nothing less. Okay, now one thing I want to point out here, because it's going to be important for a later discussion, is that this field right here, post content, this is the only field that technically we're going to call data. Okay, so the actual content of the post is the data. Okay, all of these other fields would really technically fall into metadata. They're data that describe the data. So the data is the content. These are all things that describe it. So the author isn't the content. It just tells you something about that content, which is who wrote it. The date is, again, something that tells you something about the content, which is when it was written. Even the title isn't the content itself, but it's something that describes it. It's a title for the content. Okay, so that's going to be important when we go to the next thing here in just a minute when we talk about metadata and meta tables. But again, for your objects, you're going to have an object table. You're going to have your data that you're actually collecting, and then you're going to have your key or your most crucial have-to-have metadata describing that object. Okay, so again, this is the WP post table. This is what I would describe as an object table. So if you want to write that down, the first kind of table that you're going to have is an object table that stores information about the different objects that or the different instances of a certain object. Now, you can have more than one object table. So here we have WP posts. Down here, we have WP users. Within your application, you may have more, you may have less, whatever it is, but it's the same idea for every object that you create. Now, the second type of table that you're going to have is what I call a meta table. And a meta table essentially allows you to attach custom metadata to an object, but when you don't necessarily know what that metadata is going to be. Okay, so again, if you think about when you create this application, here, these fields have to be created up front. They can't be created on the fly. So you have to know what these are as the developer when you create your application. However, there may be instances down the line where you need to add data about this object that describes it, but you don't know exactly what it's going to be. It's not necessarily vital for that object, and you don't necessarily know what it's going to be. So a meta table essentially gives you kind of a way to attach unlimited metadata, custom metadata, data that you don't necessarily or can't necessarily predict what it's going to be down the line. It gives you the ability to do that without having to come in here and add a new column to this table. Okay, because when you create an application, especially if you're releasing to other people like WordPress, people are going to kind of start to rely on your database structure. So you don't want to be adding fields all the time. Not to mention, if you just kept adding all of those fields here, you might have 100 posts that don't actually have that metadata associated with it, and only one that does. That's not very efficient. Okay, so again, we want to have a meta table. So if you see WP posts here, you also see we have WP post meta. Now, this structure is a little bit different because we not only need to specify the value, we actually need to specify the column, essentially, which is called a key in a table like this. So we're not just, we don't already have a set of columns across and we're just adding data to a column. We actually need to create something where we can create the column as well, and then we can add the value to it. Okay, and that's what a meta table essentially allows you to do. So in a meta table, this is a pretty standard meta table. What you have is you have the ID. Again, they call it meta ID here, but it's the same idea. You always ID every table, so every record has an ID number associated with it. Then you have the post ID. So this is essentially what attaches this data that we're going to add to a post. Now, you also notice down here there's WP user meta, so you can do it for all of the different objects that you have. So you'd have, for every object that you have, you could have a meta table. Now, there may be some objects that you create where you don't necessarily need a meta table, but you have to figure it out with your application. I typically lean to the side of creating a meta table simply because if you need to use it later on, it's there. If you don't have it, then it can be a pain to add later. So I generally, for every object I have, I'll add a meta table. But again, that's up to you with your application. So you have the post ID, so you're going to associate certain metadata with a post. And here we have the meta key. This is essentially the same thing as a column in the WP post table. Okay, this is what kind of data we're collecting about this post, and then the meta value is the actual value of that key or that column essentially. So you can see here for post number 2, what we've done is we've set a page template, and that page template is the default. Okay, so again, for that post, that's some metadata that helps describe that data that we can then use later. Right, so that's the second type of table, and that is a meta table. The last kind of table is a relationships table. Okay, and so this is the WordPress term relationships table. Now this is just a little bit different, but it still works for what we're doing because WordPress has gone into a full-blown taxonomy. But essentially what a relationships table does, in a lot of cases, it's really just a simple connection between the two. So if you want to say a post belongs to a category, you don't really need to have a bunch of data in order to do that. All you need to really do is have something that stores the connection between XYZ post and ABC category. All right, and that's essentially what this relationships table does. So you see where it says object ID. This is essentially the ID number of the post, whatever post object. Okay, so WP posts are ID number 1. That's the ID, same ID that we're going to use over here in our relationships table right here. So object ID number 1. The reason it's object ID is because it may be a post, it may be a page, it may be a link, it may be a user. It could be any number of different objects. Okay, so again, you have your object ID, and then you have essentially term taxonomy. Think of it as like a category. All right, so you have your category ID. So post 1 is attached to category 1. That's essentially what this database is doing. And so it's just really creating a connection between the two. You don't have to store all the data about each one because they're stored in their respective tables. This is all the information about this post is stored in the WP posts. All information about this category is stored in in this case, it's I think it's the WP terms. In yours, it might be WP categories or it might be categories or tags, whatever it is for your application. But again, the two objects are connected by this relationship table. What that allows you to do is, let's say you want to browse all posts from a certain category. Well, you can query this database and you can do a search for the category ID, and then you can get a list of all of the post IDs that are attached to that category ID, and then you can query to get information about those posts to create a list of all of the different posts that are in a particular category or associated with a particular tag or written by a specific user. Whatever two objects you're creating, connecting together. Now, one thing that's important to know is for every connection that you want to create between some objects, you need a relationships table for. So if you want to create relationships between posts and categories, you need a relationships table for that. If you want to create a relationship between posts and authors, you need a relationships table for that, with a caveat, which I'll talk about in a second. If you want to create a relationship between posts and tags, you need a relationships table for that. Whatever connections that you want to create, you need a relationships table for that. Now, the caveat that I was talking about, if we come over here to WP post, you notice that the author is actually specified here. That's another way that you can create a connection, is you can actually just list it here in the data of the object. if it's that important to that object, which an author to a post is pretty important. So that's why they've put it here. So you can put it here, but you don't want to go through and have a bunch of columns for a bunch of different objects for categories, tags, and so on and so forth. Also, if a particular object can be connected to multiple instances of another object, then generally you want to put that in a relationships table. So what I mean is a post can belong to any number of categories. It could belong to 2, 3, 4. Right? You generally want to use, if that's possible, you want to use a relationships table for that. Contrast that with an author, and the way this application is set up, and what makes most sense is that really only one post can have one author. Okay, so that's why it's okay to put the post author here and not create a full-blown relationships table for it, because one post can really only have one author. So again, when you have an object that can have a relationship to multiple instances of another object, then you typically want to use a relationships table. Okay, so those are again the three main types of tables that you're going to have when building an application. You're going to have object tables, you're going to have meta tables, and you're going to have relationships tables. Now, again, there's probably, for some obscure scenario, there could be other types of tables that you might have, but I want to give you the meat of what you're going to be doing mostly when building your applications. Okay, so what you need to do in order to put everything I've talked about here into action is, when you're sitting down to build your application, the very first thing you need to do before you open any of this, before you open a code editor, before you do any of that stuff, what you need to do is you need to sit down and figure out what objects am I going to have, what or how are those objects going to be related to one another, so the relationships that they're going to have, and then what actions are different objects going to be able to create. That's what you need to sit down and model before you ever get into any of the code. If you do that, it's really going to save you a ton of time when you get into the actual coding part of coding your application and working with your database and so on and so forth. And it's going to set you up, if you, again, when you're creating that, if for every object you create an object table and a meta table, and then for any of the relationships between the objects that you've identified, you create a relationships table, then your database structure is essentially going to be set up for, unlimited scalability and flexibility of your application going forward. And that's absolutely critical, so that you're not going back, because I can tell you, if you code out a whole application and then you realize, oh no, I need to go back and change my database structure, it affects a ton of code down the line, and it's really a pain in the butt. But you can avoid all that by thinking of your application in the terms that I've laid out for you: object tables, meta tables, and relationships tables. Now, you might be wondering, well, what about actions? Well, the actions part is actually going to be what you code. In fact, the majority of the code that you write is going to be objects taking actions. So your database is about objects and relationships part, and your code is about the actions part, which makes sense because that's what PHP is. It's a language that allows you to make things dynamic. So again, most of that action part is going to be in your actual PHP code. Okay, so that's how to structure your database. If you're building an application, sit down right now and lay out your object model, your database structure, before you go on to the next video and do anything else. So you can have that all laid out, and then when we actually start diving into code, then you can actually build something that is going to be useful and scalable and flexible and so on and so forth. All right, so again, that's how to model your application and lay out your database. Thanks for watching, and I'll talk to you in the next video.